Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristan McMahon, the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. This program is a follow-up discussion to one we had a few weeks ago with the Center for Democracy and Technology about algorithmic and digital justice. And in the course of doing research for that tea time, I came across the amazing Joshua Edmonds, who is the Director of Digital Inclusion for the City of Detroit and a Digital Inclusion Policy Fellow with the University of Michigan. And that's housed within the Poverty Solutions Initiative in the Ford School of Public Policy. Thank you for joining me for tea today, Joshua.
Thank you. And that was a very nice introduction.
Well, thank you. I try to treat my guests well, so I appreciate that. So I always like to start these conversations off with kind of a baseline. And so I think for you and me and our audience, a good baseline would be, what do we mean when we say digital equity?
Yeah, so that's a really great starter. And oftentimes I'll say that juxtaposed to what often gets said as digital inclusion and digital equity. And sometimes people will say, oh, it's digital equity and inclusion. I'm like, okay, but let's be very intentional with our wording here. And so to break it down, I'll say digital inclusion is, an active process of identifying corporations, residents, organizations, the collective into this technological ecosystem whereby you're looking at the intersection of technology and opportunity. And so it's like, how do we include as many people into that conversation and that process to counteract the digital divide? Digital equity is the methodology or the lens that we use to say, okay, who gets what and why? So if I'm going to be looking at certain communities across the United States and I'm like, well, I have a large pot of resources. Now, that might be money because pot and money makes more sense, but it could be a pot of people. How do I allocate my attention accordingly at a country, the size of the United States? How do I do it? Well, we use a digital equity framework. We say historically, who has had less access to opportunity? Who has had less access to the ability to evoke on this upward social mobility journey? And then that's us actually prioritizing digital equity. So even within our own communities, within our own cities, a digital equity framework would protect our investments in a way that if I'm going to be streamlining capital or, again, resources of any kind, I'm doing it with an equity-based lens to say that, how do I extend as much opportunity to historically people who haven't had it to actually rectify some of those issues? So that way, as we look at our future, we're just not living in an inequitable society that then technology just exacerbates, or the lack thereof, I should say.
Right. So we're not perpetuating that inequity as we move forward, in other words.
Yes.
Great. I think we should also talk a little bit about how your position came to be, because when I was doing my research, you were really the only person I found in a municipality who seemed to be doing work like this. And so this feels like a very new thing for cities and hopefully states in the country to really be struggling with.
Yeah, so this is it's a very interesting one, how it came to be. So I'm originally from the very tropical city of Cleveland, Ohio. And it's always funny when Detroiters are like, oh, you want to move here? The weather's terrible. I'm like, oh, calm down. It's like literally a 15-minute delay from what we get in Cleveland. Like, it's going to hit us eventually. But I'm from Cleveland. I was actually working in public housing originally when I first started this digital inclusion journey. I worked on President Obama's Connect Home initiative. And so really that was me saying, how do we expand as much internet access to, again, people who historically just haven't had it, which if you're going to be looking at the bedrock for that, well, that's going to be in public housing, because then it's an amalgamation of all these other societal ills. So why not technology? And so I was really working on that and just trying to find sustainable ways to address this digital divide, but at the same time, getting an understanding for why does it persist? Then fast forward, I moved into working in philanthropy at the Cleveland Foundation and was really focusing on how do we invest in these communities? How do I take a philanthropic mindset and say, okay, if I were to be investing in these communities, what would I need to do? What factors need to be put in place? Because philanthropy, you're going to have in every single one of your communities, and activating them is something that's interesting, but they're not meant to be the federal government. But in Cleveland, we did not have strong municipal support for what we're doing, which is the legacy of most cities for digital inclusion. Typically, you're going to see a lot of nonprofits pushing this work. And as a result, then you're kind of not getting your corporate buy-in, then you don't really get that federal buy-in. And so I saw an opportunity where the Knight Foundation, the University of Michigan, and the city were saying, all right, look, we all want to put into this pot and we all want to just, steward this cause ahead. So the city is saying, we'll host the person. Knight Foundation said, we'll provide the capital. And University of Michigan said, well, we'll be the bridge. And so I have a lot of bosses, obviously. But I started in the city last February, and so February 2019, and it was really just focusing on, all right, how do I create a sustainable model? And to your point, when I started looking at nationally, because that's what's going to happen, when you get in a role like this, you're saying, well, who else is doing this? So then I can maybe get a head start. I could copy some things. But then I was like, oh, well, maybe this isn't really helping me too much, because I was looking for other directors of digital inclusion. And you really don't find any. Now, that's not to say that other municipal governments haven't had a focus on this. Seattle's been doing this work for quite some time. San Jose's been doing this work. But in most cases, you're going to see like a broadband coordinator, broadband manager, but it's like, no, it's not a director of digital inclusion. And that is really, really interesting to have that type of titling, because one, I'm proximate to the mayor. I'm in the, I'm an appointed member. I'm in the cabinet. In addition, that visibility and that power allows me to then go out into my community, call my corporate leaders, call my community leaders, and then we're able to move in that capacity. And we're not saying that this is just a broadband thing. Broadband is just one part of this larger digital inclusion narrative. So when I'm seeing other broadband coordinators, I'm like, yeah, there's something I can learn from it. But when I'm looking at a director of digital inclusion, yeah, this is me now honestly accepting the responsibility that as other directors of digital inclusion begin spinning up in other communities, we in Detroit are essentially writing the playbook for what happens day one. You're a director of digital inclusion. You don't have any federal funding. What are you to do? And so I've lived through that nightmare, and I now know, and I now have the confidence, and now I'm much more comfortable with the work that we're doing in our community. And it's been a joy, but a journey to get to this point. And the journey is far from over.
I'm sure. Well, and you mentioned something there that I think is important for our audience to understand as well, is that for the most part, when we think, I think traditionally about this type of work, we are really focused on broadband to the home. And there are so many other parts that technology touches that is part of this digital inclusion conversation, and certainly the work that you're trying to do. In reading some materials, it's how so much of our life has moved online now that there are certain places that you can't even access forms unless you have access to the internet and a computer and I'm trying to think what else. Access to information. You could still get a paper newspaper, but the vast majority of people don't consume their news that way anymore. So what else, how many areas of our lives are really impacted by technology? How broad do we need to be thinking about this?
Oh, I mean, it's everything. COVID was obviously the illuminating moment for many of us in this space where, in the beginning I had to make those cases. And so I'm aware of the multiple ones because I was always making them. Like, okay, well, if I was talking to someone who maybe cared much more about aging in place, so to speak, I'm like, well, if we're aging in place, age tech means something. And if I'm looking at user experience and I'm looking at, well, why so many people, specifically the older you get, feel much more uncomfortable with technology, it's like, well, because they're using technology that really wasn't made for them. These tech companies know who they're making technology for. And so then there's a little digital divide there where it's like people just don't feel comfortable with these things. I remember having conversations specifically around broadband and how could we get people to transition to actually using it. And one of the big kickers was streaming and saying that, hey, if people are getting all these Amazon Fire Sticks or getting their Chromecast or whatever, those are all streaming options. And so to transition from cable, like my parents still have cable. And like to be able to transition from that to streaming, it's like, oh wait, you mean to tell me I can get all of this? All right, they're slowly getting it. So there's an entertainment angle, but then it intersects with this age part, and that's where that's one little digital divide. And then we go into the cybersecurity angle, where it's like, okay, are people legitimately protected online? Do they feel protected online? Truth be told, if an entity were to steal all of residents' data in Detroit, well, that's not really the city's fault. But at the end of the day, they're still our residents too. And so then it's like, well, whose responsibility is it? And so there's this cybersecurity angle specifically, and Berkeley did a nice study on cybersecurity and underserved populations. And so there's a whole other, area of research there. And then we transition over to like the school piece. We get it. K through 12, skilling up. We know there's a skills gap that's, again, being exacerbated by the lack of tech skills. That's everyone at this point. And then we obviously go to the healthcare one. That one's been proven too much. So almost feel too cliched even mentioning it, but it's like, yeah, if we're looking at the future of care delivery, we know where the intersection is. So there's various intersections all around us. I didn't talk about online banking. I didn't talk about even something as simple as any type of access to information in a broad sense. I guess the one that really hits home recently, we were actually recruiting for a position, not within the city, but within one of our partner organizations, hiring someone to be a warehouse manager. And they're like, oh, we put it on LinkedIn. See, the thing about the digital divide is that there's multiple digital divides within it. It's like a prism. And with that, there were people who were like, yeah, we might have access to the internet, but we use the internet differently. And so me using LinkedIn, me being comfortable with LinkedIn, that's almost like digital inclusion 3.0. But it's like, we're still on 1.0 of just getting people connected. But when they get connected, how are we using it? And so, I mean, it's not meant to be, it's very nuanced, and we have to acknowledge that level of nuance. But at the same time, I can't open Pandora's box too much with people, because then they get turned off and said, you know what, that's just way too much stuff you're talking. Why even engage? I might as well focus on something else where I can actually see the end goal. Whereas this, you're just talking about a whole lot of stuff. So it's a very interesting position to be in. Messaging is our greatest strength in this, but at the same time, it's our greatest weakness when we get it wrong and we message it when it's too complex, so to speak.
Well, and it's certainly tricky since there is no real one size fits all solution for this, because as you mentioned, just the varying degrees of the divide, where the divide shows up, both in access and in use, and in services and equipment. And so there are really, it seems to be almost always a somewhat chipping away at the various challenges. So you can hopefully eventually get everybody to where you need them to go, but you definitely have people at different points on that path already that you need to be dealing with. So one thing I found interesting is, so the city of Detroit has been studying this and working on its digital divide for more than a decade at this point. And so I'd love to really delve into a little bit of what the city has learned over the course of this time. So one of the early reports I read sort of listed kind of what they thought the pillars were that needed to be in place in order for the digital divide to be bridged, or at least start to get people to cross over. And one of those were to identify where the roadblocks are and how they can be handled. So what are some of the common roadblocks, or what are some of the roadblocks that have needed to be dealt with so far?
Oh man. We're surrounded by roadblocks. So several, but I'm going to frame this in a way where because we're actively like addressing all these roadblocks. So the very first one, storytelling. Oh my goodness, storytelling and media activation. We don't do a good enough job, and I would argue most communities do not do a good enough job of telling this story about one, who's doing the work, and then the remaining work that needs to be done. I think that will oftentimes point to, and especially in pre-COVID days, well, we got our library. Our library is doing a great job. They're training residents. We have a computer lab, and everyone points to them. And I'm like, yeah, but we still need this stuff to the home, and like how people live. And so it's like, okay, we need to be doing a better job of telling a story. One, again, who's doing the work, but all the work that still needs to be done, because I think we're missing the mark. And as a result of us missing the mark and us not telling that story, people think that this digital divide is just something, it's just something looming in the background. Some people might not have internet. And like they shrug their shoulders like, no, some people not having internet affects all of us, especially if we're in the shared ecosystem. That person should be hired somewhere. That person's underskilled. Like it impacts all of us, even as Americans. And so it's like, okay, community storytelling, yeah, we really need to focus on that. That's a big roadblock. In addition, I think that we have a really bad, I think it's really bad when it comes to diversifying our community technology assets. Again, if you live next to a library, you're lucky. If you don't, I mean, that's the reality. It's like, okay, well, what do you mean? Well, if I'm looking at a student, everyone knows that schools and libraries have been closing all across the United States. That is not, just germane to Detroit. It's happening everywhere. As those schools and libraries close, what are people supposed to do? who don't have the technology in the home, who don't have a printer. I've never had a printer in my house. I've always had to go to the library to print things off. And so it's like, okay, diversifying our community technology assets is a must, because it can't just be the libraries doing all this, especially in lieu of the closures. And so that's been a roadblock of ours to say, well, whose responsibility is it? As kids are going home, and then you hear the story about them going to McDonald's and doing their homework. Like that's the reality that we're facing. And I think that we've done a really bad job of actually having that conversation about how to diversify these community technology assets. In addition, our data. Data is a huge thing. I cannot drill in enough about how unprepared most communities are when it comes to addressing the digital divide, because we only use the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey is our best bet at collecting all of our information. You will go to, it doesn't matter what community you're in. Look at most digital inclusion initiatives across the United States. Everyone's going to be referencing the American Community Survey. There is value in that. But the problem with the American Community Survey is, one, that data is collected at the census tract level. I need stuff at the neighborhood and street level. That's where these problems are, not at the census tract level. In addition, that 2-year lapse on the data, I'm using 2018 data to frame a 2020 issue. So all my interventions that I made this year, I'm not going to see that progress until 2022. What does that do to a corporation who wants to see ROI? It doesn't motivate them to want to do more. And so for us, I think that on the data piece, it's a big one where we are not empowering our communities to act in a way that's specifically tailored to the people who need the resources the most. So it doesn't empower us to use a digital equity framework with the lack of data. So data is a huge roadblock. I would say lastly, this might get me in trouble, federal stagnation on digital inclusion. That stagnation has really just cut out a lot of our legs, where it's like you'll hear us yelling, oh, this is where we want to go there. We want to be an inclusive ecosystem. We want to be able to help our residents. But you really can't see the federal government making the strides to actually tailor like the recommendations to the needs of like these communities. If I'm on the ground, I'm not asking for millions and millions and millions of dollars. I'm asking for that support to actually say, pick a stance and allow us to be aligned underneath that. Without that, you have local leaders who are just kind of off to fend for themselves. And so for the city, because most cities function as spending repositories of federal resources allocated from the state, if you don't have any funding from the federal government to support digital inclusion, well, then what do you get? You just get us on the ground operating with very little resources, very little support, and we see legislation, but it's not really affording us the opportunity to do more in our community. And so I would say that's a big roadblock at most levels, but definitely at the federal level. That again, that stagnation. And so those are the 4 that I would say. There's multiple more, but I don't want to spend too much time on that. But yeah, there's a lot, and we're doing our best. I'll say the one sub point that you had also made about the lessons learned. Look, I think that we need to do a better job of our own internal data of collecting lessons learned. But I think one of the biggest lessons learned, this was actually learned through BTOP when President Obama had the Broadband Technology Opportunity Grants. And those were grants that were allocated to try and boost digital inclusion programming in communities across the United States around 2010, 2013. And during that time, you had a lot of communities who were able to mobilize, and it was great. They were getting funding, but it wasn't sustainable. And so that's one of the things where it's like digital inclusion is not a one-off, but yet the funding structures and the programmatic things that are stood up oftentimes are. And so if we know the digital divide is exacerbated by this cycle of poverty, then there needs to be a cycle of inclusion as well. And so for us, the biggest lesson learned that we know and that every community should be looking at, which the pandemic has the opportunity for us to get this right or wrong, is that nothing can be a one-off. Everything has to be operational. Everything has to be long-term. If it is not sustainable, you really might want to steer away from that and find something that is, because if not, we're going to be right back where we were 5 years from now.
Well, I guess, so following up on the sustainability conversation, I think one of the things that I've been struck by with my reading is how important partnerships are. And so both government and private, academic, business, nonprofit, because at least from what you're describing, it doesn't sound as if there is any one technically completely reliable source of funding. So in terms of sustainability, you need to keep building these bridges and these partnerships in order to sort of cycle through or have people take ownership of certain pieces of this that they then are committed to seeing through in a long-term capacity.
You said it better than I ever could. That's exactly right. I mean, it's something where I was just very, very, very fortunate to be working at the Cleveland Foundation and to get the insight that I did, saying that, whoa, wait a second. It's not philanthropy's role to support digital inclusion long term. That's not how they operate. Philanthropy is like, hey, we're going to jumpstart ecosystem, do capacity building here, 2 to 3 year increments max, and then we're focused on something else. But if this digital divide is always going to be an issue, well, philanthropy has a role to play, but not just as a de facto funder. And so that got me thinking, okay, you guys have a role to play. There's multiple philanthropic entities in Detroit. There's corporate entities as well. How do I make digital inclusion digestible for you? How do I build out this swim lane for you to say, okay, I'm comfortable investing in this because it relates to this. So I have to give credit to one of our biggest corporate partners, Quicken Loans. And Quicken Loans, they've been just a massive help in helping us frame things and actually being a big investor. They provided seed funding for our digital equity fund. And that's something where you say, oh, is that a social good thing? Yeah, it is. But at the same time, they have to hire in Detroit. And so they're like, well, if we have more tech jobs coming out, we can't keep picking people from the suburbs. We need to be developing our own talent here and building a pipeline for us to hire from. So it's like, yeah, Quicken Loans is going to invest. No different than General Motors. General Motors invested a lot of money into this initiative because they're like, as we move into electric vehicles, there's no way that if we have this persistent huge digital divide that we can feel really confident and safe saying electric vehicles. Like it doesn't make sense. And so if they're going to be part of the ecosystem, it's my job to essentially say, hey, this is your swim lane. Let's not look at this in a buckshot capacity because that's going to turn you off because you might not care about the future of healthcare delivery. For that, I have my healthcare institutions for that. You might not care about Detroiters being underbanked. I have my banks at the table for that. And so giving everybody their respective swim lanes and then allowing them to see it, that then puts me in the position to say, oh yeah, we're much more sustainable because I know these companies aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And so in lieu of the lack of federal funding, I'm exhausting the local resources as much as possible to showcase we have a sustainable model, we're thinking about outcomes, and federal government, if you were to invest, you were going to be investing alongside of the private and public sector.
Which, fingers crossed, would make it more attractive since they would understand that they're not the only funders, right?
That's my hypothesis. So we'll see.
Okay, we'll check back in with you in a couple of years and see how that panned out. Well, and you said something earlier too that made me that twigged something as you were following up with this, and that this is really a community challenge and a community issue, and that everybody in the community needs to buy into this need to advance this, because it is, as you said, if you're looking for people to fill your jobs and they don't have access to the internet, you may not get the robust pool that you're hoping for. Or if you are looking for teachers, or if you're looking for ways to support, I don't know, after school programs or something along that line, if those resources aren't there to provide for that, then the community as a whole has some gaps. And I think that you're right, that for a lot of us, it is, what does it really matter if 10% of our city doesn't have access to this? Because that seems like a small number, but not really cottoning on to the fact of, well, that's 10% that part of your community isn't contributing to the community in the way that the rest of the community is. And they don't, through no fault of their own, really, they don't have that opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. And I'm going to steal this from a brilliant mind at the Cleveland Foundation. I told him I was going to steal this, but Leon Wilson, he was my former boss here. He's a chief digital innovation officer and CIO, and he coined this the 2030 conundrum. And the 2030 conundrum is that if you're going to look at most large urban cities across the United States, there's about 20 to 30% of the residents who don't have internet of any kind. And you'd say in the beginning, well, within that city, that's already bad. But then across the United States, you mean to tell me that a third? I mean, that's the reality. So it's like when we're looking at our workforce, when we're looking at really anything, like if I'm, for example, we have DTE is our energy company here, also a fantastic help. And as they're rolling out new technology, new apps that help, track energy insights and spending, They're like, well, wait, we're spending all our research and development dollars on building this thing. You mean to tell me 30% market share is just not going to get it out of the gate? What does that then do to our tech entrepreneurship economy? What does it do to our gig economy? We are hindering ourselves here. And so I understand on the basis when people have these very strong opinions about subsidies and about, helping people, I understand fundamentally where they're coming from to an extent. But we do ourselves a disservice nationally by having cities who are not having people who are online. And if the people are online without quality internet, we do ourselves a disservice here. This is our workforce. These are people that as we develop things, well, we're just going to sacrifice 30% market cap out of the gate. Like that doesn't make any sense. And so that's why at the very basis of this argument, I'm like, look, it is for all of our best interests. It's okay for people to be selfish here. That's fine. Like you can be selfish and say, hey, I want more people using my app, so therefore I care about people getting online. Perfectly fine. I'm aligned with that and saying that I want people getting online too. We have different outcomes, obviously, but again, that 2030 conundrum is something where I don't think that people are thinking like that. And if they were thinking like that, I think that political stagnation would clear up a little bit, just knowing that, yeah, we're really missing out here. And I'm not going to say the correlation because it's already been drilled deep into our head about the dangerous effects of the census and how this is now playing out, just how many of us would have thought that, wow, would you look at that? Some of the most digitally divided cities in America have some of the lowest response rates on a census that's predominantly online. Like those are the things where I'm like, yeah, it writes itself at this point.
Well, and so we've been talking a lot about access too, but there's also challenges on the participation or adoption side of this as well. So there is work also that needs to be done in the communities for the people who have been traditionally, and I'll use the word disenfranchised here, who haven't had this access. So once access is provided, teaching them how to use it or getting them comfortable with using it as well. So what are some of those tactics in order to increase participation and adoption?
Yeah, this is a parallel that it might work. Just go with me. And if it doesn't, you can just shake your head showing like, oh, where's he going? But in a lot of communities, specifically your urban communities, you'll see kids walking around dribbling basketballs. And you'll see basketball courts in a lot of these neighborhoods too. It's like, oh, wow. It's almost as if our environments directly foster a sense of what it is that we do or our affinity to certain things. And so when I start talking about diversifying neighborhood and community technology assets, I'm getting at that notion that are we seeing ourselves in a tech-enabled future if we're devoid of technology in our neighborhoods? And so that's where the adoption play comes in, because we need to begin reinforcing technology values and the affinity and the comfort for technology in our community spaces. And so one of the things that we're really focusing on is rolling out neighborhood technology hubs, saying like, hey, let's look at some of these land bank homes or homes that need to be rehabbed and transforming those into neighborhood technology hubs. And that's something where we're getting at the root of, okay, if let's say, for example, cost isn't the barrier for you. Maybe you have money. And it's just like, look, that internet thing, that's not for me. I don't want my kids using computers because the government's spying on me, whatever. Those are the type of things that as we begin looking and deploying infrastructure and communities where, oh, okay, I know that church. And if pastor is telling me about this technology, or if my community leader is talking to me about this, empowering and having those discussions in ways that, again, maybe these internet providers just can't do. I think we need to be acknowledging individuals in our community and what our community is made of, and then specifically and strategically enhancing or integrating technology into those respective areas. And so, again, the neighborhood technology hubs is our really big focus, but in addition, we're also focusing on community ambassadors. How do we empower them with the information as we're getting it? To say, hey, no, that big bad internet, not so bad. Just make sure you don't click on these links and make sure you download this and whatever. I mean, those are the things that we want to focus on. I have said that anywhere where people are waiting, we should have computers. It sounds weird, but it's like, if you're waiting to get your driver's license, put a computer in there. If you're waiting at the doctor's office, computer. Dentist's office, computer. And getting people just to see and just play, just interact. I know it probably seems like, oh, well, why would you do that? But again, it's more so just reinforcing that, hey, this is a future and it doesn't have to be scary. This is going to be something that you can just interact with. And I don't think we've given enough people a fair shot at that. So as a result, It's a really, really massive gap that we have to bridge outside of, hey, I can't afford it. I just don't feel comfortable with that. And me, Joshua Edmonds, talking to a resident about that, what am I to do? But if you see it in your community, you see that infrastructure all around you, then you might start thinking a little bit differently about it.
And are you finding that at least that part of the divide is more generational, that, you know, students perhaps are easier adopters if they had access to it versus older residents, or is it also potentially nationality? We've had a lot of these conversations talking about the intersectionality of a lot of different areas. And so, you know, are there certain things that you are seeing in communities, or are there certain communities that seem to adopt this less easily? I don't really want to say that they're resistant to it, but just have a struggle with the adoption of it.
Yep. Yes. So social economics definitely plays, like, that's the biggest role. When we're looking at the American Community Survey data, social economics, like how much people's income plays a huge role in their attitudes toward technology and their just ability to fully adopt in a way that someone who is obviously making above the median income most likely is. In addition to that, we also know that high school or education attainment, that plays a role in it. Race is interesting because you'll see that Black and brown communities across the United States do have cell phones. That's one thing where it's like, yeah, there's a huge thing, like, wow, we have a lot of cell phones. But when it comes to computers and when it comes to high-speed internet, there's this drop in it. And you might be wondering, you'd say, oh, well, maybe it's just because these communities don't want it. Oh, that's not true. I think there's a lot of socioeconomic factors that are found within these communities that then cause the output to look a little bit different. And so I don't think that there's and I know you didn't say this, but I know that there's not a resistance per se. I think there's socioeconomic factors within these communities that then cause a cell phone to be much more practical, especially if I'm moving 2, 3, 4 times a year. Home internet service actually doesn't make too much sense then, especially because if I'm in a contractual agreement, I break that contract, I have an extra bill to pay. Well, no, I'm just gonna stick with my cell phone. In addition, most communities are duopolies when it comes to their internet providers. And so if I have a past due bill with one, I get a past due bill with another, okay, well then I'm out. However, if I'm looking at cell phone companies, you go into some of these urban cores, you see like 10, 12 different cell phone companies you never heard of. I can essentially keep jumping over if I get kicked off. And so that's a reality that's happening. And I don't think that story gets told enough, where I'm looking at the correlation of people who are underbanked and unbanked and how that correlates to the digital divide, specifically on the standpoint of living in a duopoly where perpetual billing is going to disqualify you from those two offerings. And so I do think that by race, there is something where there's something to be said. There's enough information out there where we know that's the reality. But I would say the aforementioned factors on age, income, and high school attainment, those actually do contribute to people actually having high-speed internet. That's data that's out there. We know that to be true. And so I think it's our job to say, okay, as you are coming into your internet journey and awakening, some of us have naturally been able to integrate, but others not so much. What infrastructure can I begin trying to deploy to make everyone as seamless as possible? And so one of the anecdotes I'll bring up is when I was in Cleveland working in public housing, we actually deployed really high-speed internet for free in one of our senior public housing estates. And in the beginning, you had a lot of the seniors who were like, no, not using it. No, I've made it this far. I don't need that internet. But then something happened. Slowly, people started using it. And then the grandkids started coming over because it was gigabit speed internet. And so then it's like, well, some of them like, I don't really care about that internet, but my family cares about it. And that's something where, okay, there's merit there. And I think that we should be exploring things like that and taking the total individual and their individual wants and needs juxtaposed with this digital divide and finding the right entryways into it, and not just saying, hey, low cost internet, because clearly that's not working. And so we're pretty nuanced in our understanding of this and trying to create a program that is tailored to that level of nuance, which isn't too difficult, too easy, but
yes, no, yeah,
we're trying.
with all of those nuances, that must be very, very simple to do. Yes. Well, and so this does bring a question on how does mobile technology factor into this? Because a lot of these conversations are focused, as I said, on broadband to the home and making sure that that is of an appropriate speed, so it actually qualifies as broadband. But for certain residents, that may never be what they want. They may only ever want the internet here. And so how does mobile technology factor into this conversation?
Oh man, yes, it does. There's a lot of demystifying that we had to do on that front. Specifically, letting people know that, guys, look, I can't get you hired in a tech job and you're pecking at a keyboard because you've been doing this all day on your mobile phone and thinking that that works. This is a productivity issue, and I will keep drilling that in. You know, I had two wonderful, incredible interns last summer. And both of them, one went to university. They both graduated now. One went to University of Chicago. One went to University of Michigan. And when they had graduated high school, when they got into their respective schools, neither one of them knew how to type. That's something where it's like, okay, let's slow all the way down. You knew how to text, but you didn't know how to type. This is hindering our future here. And so the mobile play is one where we have to keep and remaining vigilant, saying that, yeah, access is one thing, but we need to have levels of that and saying what's adequate for our community, what's adequate for our future. And we know that typing is an adequate skill set, at least now. Maybe sometime we're going to get something that, allows us to think words on the screen. But until we get to that point, this is going to be something that is a differentiating factor that we need to really be paying attention to. In addition, when I moved to my respective neighborhood in Detroit, my cellular coverage was awful. And I get that people are saying, well, you're connected and you have, unlimited, which is not really unlimited, but you have enough of a data allowance allow you to do what you need to do. But at the same time, if the speed isn't there, if my network coverage isn't there, networks are always going to be, at least in the near future that I can see, that's probably about maybe a couple years out, mobile networks are always going to be inferior to wired broadband connections in a home. There's no way you're going to get around it. And so I often wonder if we are okay with people using the mobile networks, are we okay with them having a subpar experience when it comes to the internet speeds, internet reliability? If now we know specifically in a work from home capacity that if this is the case and people are doing this, every single time their call drops, that's the equivalent of my interview stopping that I'm going for a job. That's an equivalent of me taking a break from my learning. Those are the things that I'm like, we can't act like it's a legitimate parallel. It's not. It is a really, really, really good Band-Aid. It's a really, really good Band-Aid, but it is not equivalent. And I think that we have a lot more learning to do and unlearning, if you will. And eventually, originally we were acting as if this was good enough. But as we're now realizing, no way is it good enough. And I think that there's a lot more that we should be demanding from providers, specifically when it comes to coverage and what's stated and what people get. I don't have to go too far down into that rabbit hole, but I've had some talks with my cellular provider, and yeah, it's a multifaceted fight. It's good enough if you have no other option, but by no means would I want that good enough for my family or my community.
Well, and so we should touch on this just a little bit, because as you said, with the American Community Survey data that's at the census level, and with the 2-year lag, the FCC data from cellular companies or from internet service providers as well is self-reported, and also and is zip code specific. So, in the Jamestown area, we have a handful of zip codes. And so if even one house in any of those zip codes is served, it is considered that the zip code is served. So, and that's across the country. That's not just our area, obviously. But that then tends to overstate the amount of access that people have to the internet.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I still got some battle scars from this fight. So yes, one of the things that I have said is, like, it might not be the municipality's responsibility, but there really, really needs to be some consumer protection on this front. Specifically on, are you getting as a community what you're paying for? Are you really getting the speeds that you're paying for? Is it really unlimited? Like, and even if you're having an issue, that's you as one person going against this corporation. I don't necessarily know how that empowers you to be able to move the needle on anything. Moreover, I think that when we leave anybody to their own devices, whether that's, and I'm not sure if you've seen the viral videos of people setting like food in front of their dog and saying, don't eat it, don't eat it. And it's like, well, okay, the dog's gonna make its own decision. And the same thing goes with providers, and I'm not comparing providers to dogs per se. What I'm saying is like when unregulated and when we leave them to their own devices, they're gonna do what they wanna do. And so if I'm a provider that wants to save on costs, well, I'm gonna do what I wanna do. And I'm gonna use a various amount of data and framing to justify why I'm going where I'm going. I think that there's a real novel way that you could do that, which I know is already being done, saying that, well, in this income area, they're not really gonna be able to afford a service anyway, so why roll out the premium? They can't afford it. And so it's like, okay, that now goes into the topic of digital redlining, which the folks in Cleveland took that against one of the big providers there in a big way, which has now reverberated to other communities. So that does happen. And I think that it's our responsibility that anywhere it does happen, that we are advocating with our residents in a collective form. So that way they're not going off by themselves, and that, you know, again, them facing corporation, like that's, we don't want that to happen. But two, with that oversight, with the data that we're collecting, that we know we need to be collecting, we're then saying to the providers, look, let's work together here, because you're not leaving tomorrow and we're not leaving tomorrow. And so since we know that, we might as well work together on this. Yeah, you might have did some crappy things. Not really gonna forgive you for that. But again, we have to work together, because with these lapses in data, that's still hindering us as a city from moving forward on anything. And that's still potential clients that you guys are losing too. And so, I mean, it's something where making those needs up front and focusing on that data piece to empower us to make the decisions we need to make, but at the same time being transparent and honest and saying, if you're going to be deploying any type of infrastructure or service within our community, you need to be meeting this threshold. And typically people don't take the fights to the provider in that, because lo and behold, your FCC doesn't make them do that. So why would they do that at a local level? And so I think what we're trying to do in Detroit is say, all right, let's build a table big enough for all of them to be at the same table. Let's identify the values for our community and how we know we need to be treated given the future that we want. And then say, hey, FCC, I'm not saying this is how you guys need to do your job, but this is how we are setting the table. And it would be really nice if that table would be mirrored at the state level and at the federal level.
Interesting. Okay. So before we open it up to questions, I think the last thing I want to ask is, so in the 2009 report that Detroit prepared as sort of its first initial study, they mentioned that they were trying to create, and I'm sorry, this wasn't in the 2009, this was in the 2018 report, to create a 10-year plan. So I just, out of curiosity, how is that plan going?
It's going. No, so I would say right now we are 10 years is a bit ambitious. Now we're at maybe a more of a 4-year plan. Okay. So we've been framing everything to say, hey, by 2024, and that's going well. We're getting stakeholders to buy in. We are building out our Connect 313 community council and a whole governing body. This year, we established that digital equity fund. We were able to raise $23 million to get 51,000 kids laptops. That's theirs. Internet connections, that's theirs. Like, nope. And so we are putting the necessary infrastructure in place to be able to confidently say, hey, 4 or 5 years from now, this is where we are going to be, given our investments right now. I think 10 years is just ambitious to say, because it's going to, this landscape is changing a lot. And who knows? Maybe I know for certain it's not going to be tomorrow that any type of digital equity passes and at the broad or at the Senate level. But I do know that those conversations are happening much more, which does give me some type of confidence to say that if long-term funding is something that we need to be able to adequately say where we'll be 10 years from now, the more we can do to sway the federal government to envisioning or pushing that forward and making that a reality for us, that gives me more confidence to say, oh yeah, 10 years from now, we're going to be there. I'm not going to say that right now. I'll just say, yeah, we have a 4-year focus. And with that, I think that we are getting stakeholders aligned. We're getting people bought into that. And I feel very confident with where we're going there. But 10 years, not so much.
Well, and that actually leads quite nicely into one of the questions that we received from Helena. And so when you look at the far-reaching detrimental effects of poor access to the internet with regard to employment and housing and healthcare issues, is there one particular federal agency that is best to take the lead on a national policy initiative, or does it have to be broader than that?
Oh my goodness, whoever asked that question, thank you so much. That tees it up very nicely. So I just believe that my role should exist at every single level of government. Not necessarily a broadband coordinator, not someone who just is kind of working half-time or a program manager somewhere. No, a director of digital inclusion. There needs to be one at the state level. There needs to be one at the federal level, ideally within the White House. Because at that point, no different than what I'm doing now, I am landing various ships as it relates to this cause and divvying up responsibilities that are germane and naturally aligned with the functions of whatever office or organization that there is. And so as I'm talking to my banks, that's one argument. Talking to my folks in workforce, that's another argument. And me being at the center, coordinating all of that, that coordination needs to go all the way up and needs to flow back down. And so I don't believe it should be one particular entity. So I pick on the FCC a lot because the FCC is like, well, it's easier for me to pick on them. Like, they're more front and center, and they actually talk about bridging the digital divide. I think they misdiagnose some of the stuff, but they're pretty front and center here. But I do believe it needs to be someone within the White House that's stewarding this throughout the various different entities and organizations and agencies. No different than what we're doing right now. We have a governance structure that I do believe could be and should be replicated at every single level of government.
Okay. We also received a question from Sarah, and I'm going to ask it a little bit more broadly because she's very much focused on this in our community, which you would not necessarily have insight into. But she mentions that in Los Angeles and Santa Ana, she saw tables set up in low-income areas to sign people up for free phones or to help them with internet access. Is this something that happens? Are you aware of in sort of like a more global, in a more global instance? Is this something that is part of Detroit's plan as to, going into the communities and working with the constituencies that don't have this access or don't have, whether that's to services or to equipment, and helping them work through those challenges?
Absolutely. That's and glad to see that work happening. And that's definitely happened here. Particularly, that's meeting people where they are. And that's not saying, hey, everyone come downtown to sign up, or everyone go to the corporate office at Comcast and sign up. It's like, no, let's meet people where they are. Let's go to barbershops. Obviously, in the age of social distancing, that's forced us to be very, very creative with this, which then exposed us for like, hey, maybe we don't have this all figured out. Maybe we are assuming a lot of things. But, we have an entity called Human IT. Human IT is a nonprofit social enterprise. They're actually based out of Los Angeles that has expanded operations to Detroit. And pretty much they're the entity that takes in all technology and they refurbish it, redistribute it to residents. At the same time, they're also that same entity that's signing up residents for whatever internet's best for them. And so us having an entity like that allows us to then steward those relationships and partnerships with our community ambassadors in tandem with their work. And so our whole focus has been on operationalizing this stuff. So it's not done in one-off capacities. We're doing it strategically. So if I'm saying, hey, we need to be setting up tables where people are gathering, I'm using data and insights to say exactly where. And if I'm also not saying that, hey, we need to fundraise and get 500 computers. No, we have an entity that does all that for us. And so us getting really smart and automating and operationalizing as much functions as possible and using data to determine where resources should be allocated. That's the back end that I think a lot of communities aren't doing. A lot of communities are focusing on doing things on the front end, which is setting up the table and, oh, we're going to go here and sign people up. You need that. But on the back end, you need to have that entity in place that as you're doing this, it's sustainable and resources will always be able to be allocated. instead of having to pause and fundraise.
Well, and you raise a good point too, that some of the data on which communities traditionally rely, again, is, awfully broad and has a 2-year time lag. So have you developed, or are you working on developing your own data set?
Yes, we are. Yeah. Oh man, there's been so much pacing on my part about, okay, how do I get all of this right, or as much right as possible? And on this one, we just have some really, really great minds at the table, leveraging consulting firms, Microsoft, just a litany of partners to say, how do we leverage machine learning? How do we leverage as much stuff as possible, but not in a big brother capacity? As soon as I start talking about data, people are then saying, oh, well, what resident data are you collecting? I'm like, we're not really doing that. Like, I don't really care what someone Googles. I'm more so focused on, okay, what houses don't have internet access? And then form factor to what internet access they do have. Do you have internet, but is it mobile? Do you have internet, or is it broadband? Do you have internet, or is it DSL? Understanding that. And then digital literacy, digital skills. Where are you on that? How comfortable do you feel? What's the sentiment analysis here? Then devices, form factor. What type of device do you have? Is it a phone? Is it a tablet? Is it a laptop? Like, those are the things. And then from there, you're able to take all three of those sub things. There's going to be more data underneath that, but those three main ones. And then it boils down into, well, how tech employable is Detroit? Well, I can answer that question now. How healthcare ready is Detroit from a telehealth standpoint? I can answer that now. And so all of those things are exactly what we're building. We're calling that a shared service, specifically as we've been referring to as a data trust, and using as much data as possible to literally create the most complete data on the topic. So then we can say to the federal government, this is what you need, because the whole war is going to be on who has a better data set. And right now they have a lot more data than we do, just because the providers are self-reporting. But when we activate ours, and this isn't something that I'm saying, 2 years from now, we actually want to have this stood up, at least the first iteration of this, before the end of the year. And so this is something where that data trust is going to continuously evolve as we get more data in. It's not meant to say, we're set on data, we don't need any more. No, we are going to continuously refine and add as more data becomes available, as more data sets allow us to then create pseudo digital equity scores that allow us to then tailor our investments accordingly.
And can I ask how long you've been working on this?
Conceptually, I would say that was actually last year. I just started focusing on that a bit, where I'm like, man, I don't feel really too empowered with this data. Now, trust me, I know my American Community Survey data. I can give you darn near every single data point. It's literally next to my nightstand. Like, I look at this data all the time, just so it keeps me like, okay, yeah, you had a really good meeting, but 29% of Detroiters still don't have internet. And so it keeps me grounded. But I would say that from a legitimate, let's put the metal to the road, that actually happened in June, where we really said, hey, let's build out this data trust. And again, we're looking at before the end of the year, like maybe around November, to actually have that stood up in a way where we could then start empowering people who are doing this work much more. But again, that's Detroit specific, but it is replicable. And so other communities should have this too. So, we're not doing it just as a one-off for Detroit, but certainly that's our focus right now.
We got a question from Deidre, and she wants to know, how much influence did the closing of the schools and moving basically everything online shine a bigger light on these issues?
A lot, significantly, but I am going to do something that is just weird. So I've been telling all the stakeholders, there's merit in the fact that we were focusing on the digital divide prior to the pandemic. There's merit there. And so for the communities that were doing that, I'm looking at them like, yeah, you guys are doing it because it's the right thing to do. For the folks who are now coming up and trying to build coalitions off of the pandemic, I think that's slightly problematic, because you're doing it in response to something. And I think that's just a little bit dangerous. Now, that's not to say that there hasn't been value in it. There's no way in the world I would be moving like this right now. February. And so the fact that we are now where we are is directly because of the pandemic. And so we were able to raise that $23 million and then get an additional $2 million of seed funding from Quicken Loans to stand up our digital equity fund. Those were goals that I had outlined for maybe 5 years from now. So when you were talking about that 10-year plan, I'm like, a lot of this stuff got shifted because of the pandemic. People kept saying, well, what else can we do? What else can we do? So I'm like, well, then fine. I'm just going to take everything else supposed to be 10 years and we're just going to condense it to 2, whatever. And so I would say the pandemic had a direct correlation to what you're seeing now. But I do think that there's a bit of an aftershock that's a bit dangerous with it, specifically on folks who are looking at this as a solvable thing, that they're just going to dump as much money as possible into it. And you can't spend your way out of the digital divide. And so when I'm looking at the amount of money that's being raised, I'm a little bit hesitant to endorse all of these raisings and say, like, who might endorse it? But it's just something where I'm just looking at it and I'm like, I don't feel too good about that. So I think the pandemic can be used to further causes, but the foundation should have been established prior to the pandemic. So therefore, you were already aligned with doing it because it was the right thing to do and not just in response to the pandemic.
And does that go back to our sustainability discussion, that because it is in response to this, that inherently probably makes it less long-term?
Absolutely. 1,000,000,000%.
Good. I'm glad I was listening. Okay. So, one, you touched on this a little bit, and I want to explore this a little bit further too. What can municipalities that are interested in doing this work, I guess, sort of, what do they need to know in order to begin? So if they're not already on this path, what advice would you have for them? What do they need to have in place, or what do they need to be thinking about and looking to?
They need to, one, have a director of digital inclusion. Every single municipality in America needs to have a director of digital inclusion. And I don't care. Heck, I'm not hired by them. Look, if you have broadband coordinators and that person has been there for some years, and I'm looking at certain cities, I'm not going to name them, but there's certain American cities that have people who are way smarter than me, who are in positions with no power or no authority to really get this stuff moving. You need to be promoting those people and putting them proximate to the mayor, because these are people who have the ability to do even more than what Detroit is doing. But Detroit, we gambled big. And I also want to say that municipalities, it is a gamble. So to think that you're just going to get a director of digital inclusion, it's all going to work. Well, I'm going to let you know that there was a lot of gambling. One, because, I always tell the story of how the media did me no favors. When I got hired, there was media release story after story about he's the answer to bridging the digital divide and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh gosh. I'm looking at this with $0 in a budget. I don't have a budget. And so I'm like, how the heck am I supposed to do this? And so when people ask, so Josh, what are you going to do? I'm like, I don't know. So then I had to turn into a politician and give really general platitudes. And I hated that too. And so I think that there is going to be a massive, there was massive growing pains associated with this, but you still need to do it. Because if you don't do it, then you're just going to wait. And you don't want to be waiting either. So one, getting a director of digital inclusion. Two, understanding that's a gamble. You need to be taking a risk here. I'm sorry. Funding might not ever become available. So whoever you're doing that work, they need to be knowing that, hey, I need to be building these relationships and activating this in my community. And on the third level, you're not going to get as much help that you think, specifically from the federal government. They are not the best people to really, as it stands right now, to really be backing us. I don't look at the federal government being empowered by them. And so like, typically I would like that. I would like to be empowered by them so I can do more so that I'm co-signed locally, but that's just not the reality. And so I would say that going down this path, probably be incredibly frustrated, but we still need to do it. And at any opportunity to actually be the megaphone and to land all the stakeholders that need to be landed, your community and your private sector, understand the role that you play, but cities cannot own this. So Connect 313, you don't hear me saying, oh, the city of Detroit's digital inclusion program. Now, some people might say that, and they're not totally wrong, but they're wrong enough in that no city can own digital inclusion outright. It needs to be an external partnership structure for which the city has a seat at the table, because we can see the entire ecosystem, but we need our community with us. But it can't be an imbalance that we have so much community that we don't have corporate. You need corporate with you too. And so you need that balance. You need to have a master mediator at the middle of all of that. And that is your director of digital inclusion. And so every city needs to have that. And then the rest of the stuff that I'm doing is going to make much more sense if it doesn't already.
All right. So one final question, and this is from Tori. She would like to know, where can philanthropy focus its energy and dollars to help now, even if there wasn't an effort to address the needs prior to COVID-19, bringing the issue to the forefront?
Oh my goodness. Wherever you are, you're great. That is exactly the question you should be asking. And man, so philanthropy has several roles to play. And again, I can say this, having worked in philanthropy, I know where they're best. And even now, as I'm working with all my philanthropic organizations in Detroit, and then they're not all created equal. So I understand that. Some have larger endowments than others. But philanthropy is a convener. Everyone knows that. And so it's like, if you don't have the ability to really push out significant capital, convene, use that convening power and co-sign some of the work that's already being happened. Like, you don't necessarily have to be coming up with it, but saying like, hey, I've had a chance to weigh in on this and I would like to start convening stakeholders. Unfortunately, COVID isn't going to allow us to really have summits, but last year, I had a digital inclusion summit. That was great. I had my philanthropic entities pushing and getting the word out there. That meant more to me than whatever sponsorship that they were going to give me. I needed their word. I needed their buy-in. I needed other people to know that we were aligned, because philanthropy has the relationships in the community, because everybody's trying to get money or resources from them already. So if you're trying to get this cause out there, they're a great convening partner. You need that. So convening, stay on that tip. 2, funding a study. Unfortunately, I don't read too many of the studies anymore, because a lot of the information is just the same. I already know it. It's like, okay, cool. Whatever way you're going to slice and dice the data, we've already seen it. We get it. People don't have internet, whatever. But there's merit in having a study that is done locally that then acts as a rallying call. And philanthropy can fund a study. It's not, when I ask for a whole lot of money here, $7,500, $10,000, whatever, funding that study then gives whoever's doing this work some type of legitimacy to stand on and say, hey, this was our study made personal to us by our community. Thank you to X Foundation for doing that. In addition, straight up capital, absolutely. So capital is its own thing. That's going to be contingent on whatever community you're in. So I don't know what asks are out there. But I would say the 4th thing, being a thought partner. I've had so many people, because again, army of one, who are saying to me, hey, Josh, I don't really have money, but I'll go in the war room with you. So I got people who are in the trenches with me as I'm freaking out and flipping out about whatever. They're just a really, really nice thought partner to have. They have my back. And trust me, that means more to me than, well, I shouldn't say that means more to me. And that means a lot to me. I mean, obviously the money means a lot, but that means a whole lot to me. And I promise you, if you start looking at these digital inclusion communities, they need that. They need people who are going to be there and having their back, because it does feel like you're on an island a whole lot of the time. And so having people who are in the trenches with you, I think philanthropy is uniquely positioned to be that person or that entity, because they're such a neutral entity.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for joining us for tea today. A reminder that this Saturday, the Jackson Center and its partners will be celebrating the 75th anniversary of the signing of the London Agreement and Charter with a worldwide free webinar called The Age of Robert H. Jackson, London, Nuremberg, and Today. Ben Ferenz will be joining us, along with friends from the International Bar Association, the International Nuremberg Principals Academy, Case Western Reserve School of Law, and the Whitney R. Harris World Law Institute, and Courtroom 600 in Nuremberg as panelists for this chat. It is a free webinar, although pre-registration is required, so please go to roberthjackson.org in order to register for this free event. Joshua, thank you so very much for having tea with me today. I appreciate it. Cheers. And this is actually our 19th weekly program that we've been doing during the COVID times. And so I am actually taking a break next week. So there will not be a tea next week. And we will see you in 2 weeks. And I look forward to that. So thank you very much, everyone.